Hello everyone, today we talk about the mid-14th century crisis and in particular the drop in population in the countryside and in the cities during the second half of the 14th century. As you know, we started from the very early days of Schwerpunkt to talk about the effects of the Black Death, of the plague, its recurrent, cyclical in fact, reappearance that would come to define, in fact, world history in Europe. I think the last plague was in France, like in the beginning of the 18th century. Besides, we don't know exactly everything. Very often, we do not have a clear pathological understanding of these diseases. We tend to assume a bit too much. Paradoxically, these are very mysterious dynamics at large, sometimes treated as causes of the further decline. I prefer, paradoxically, the idea of being the consequence of a previous deterioration. And today we will talk in part about this, because this is mostly where the mid-14th century crisis topic ends up revolving to, like understanding this as a laboratory phenomenon. It's a kind of strange natural dynamic, so that you observe Europe, say its populace, its civilization, its demographics in general, and then the plague arrives and you just analyze how this hit the system, and conceive it really in these terms, or do you actually look at what was happening before, or mostly realizing that this single factor, the plague, wasn't actually even necessarily the most severe to some extent. Maybe in individual terms it could be, all right, relatively to the others, but altogether, depending on which ones they are, by the way, because how do you personalize or factorialize, for example, warfare? All right, that is something you can, of course, take in consideration, but there you have at least to enter in order to explain it. They're just the realms of politics, but the one of moral dimensions, right? Why did these people move, for example, after the plague? This is today's topic. We don't talk about the plague per se. We'll mostly try to answer the question, did the cities or the rural areas experience the most severe drop in population? And not just why, because actually I already answered this question elsewhere. If you want the quick answer, I have even a late medieval crisis, literally, playlist, I think it's titled like that, where we really looked at different aspects of the mindset towards the pandemic, the demographic drop. In medieval, you always talk this also in general, right, for medieval demographics, not just the late medieval crisis. Let's dig into this and just make a bit of clarity. Now, the fact that diseases spread more readily in places where people live in greater numbers and closer together strongly suggests, of course, that death rates were higher in urban areas. Depending, however, on the concept of spread proper, meaning that if you are spaced out, it's less likely for this disease to simply spread. After all, when you look at those maps about the progression of Black Death in time and intensity across Europe, think how we don't really see too much of that for Asia, for example, because we fundamentally lack information. But even for Europe, what do we actually know about that, and how reliable all this info is? Because about what we just said, you would think that, I don't know, in less densely populated countries, the plague would have sort of different effects. This is not true for Eastern Europe, but for example, and apparently, and probably, by the way, for real, spared country in this sense was Poland. Poland gained an incredible advantage over other countries, apparently, because the plague was less intense there for some reason. and this heavily contributed to the stabilization of the Polish monarchy that at the time fared considerably well. It became ever more internationally relevant, etc. Conversely, we see centers like, Milan or certain Flemish cities that apparently, again, these are well-documented areas, did not get the plague, right? Which is also unlikely, just per se. Maybe there wasn't any major outbreak, less people died, but this already tells you, what's the reason of it? Because we know from pandemic spreading patterns that at large, these things can't be stopped, right? In practice, regardless also of how you try to contain them, especially with the means of the time, even where we're talking about population sparsity, because again, in Scandinavia they had it, in other countries, it's not like we know that that was in the simple equation, as we're pointing out before. Poland, yes, was a bit isolated compared to other kingdoms, but after all was pretty central in the European landscape in general. And it also continued to be a point of reference, in fact, for long-range trade that was ignited especially by this phenomenon. Poland fundamentally had more labor force because it was spread by the plague, and so even though it wasn't a particularly advanced country technologically or economically, it had literally the capacity to export lots of grain, of timber. But what about Milan or Brugge? Or how could these centers be basically isolated and not being hit by the plague? The answer to this is that while it's possible that certain things happen for some reason, in relative terms, we actually don't know that much about how this phenomenon spread, right? I worked with lots of chronicles exactly at the beginning of this period because my research stopped to fundamentally 48, right, 50, depending on where. And I was reading many chronicles at a time from places that are well documented, to say the least. And the picture there is not confusing because you start getting this info. But first of all, this plague is not too important, right? They record it. Some of the chroniclers themselves died into it, as far as we know. But it's not actually this huge deal, right? There were much more apparently shocking events that included natural disasters. Of course, wars, like the backdrop of all this is always some political novelty that brings unrest, battles, major regional, international issues. The plague, for all its importance, does not seem to be even this first top. Of course, by 48, mostly you do have entire paragraphs dedicated to that. It's not like it wasn't a big deal, but in the bigger picture, it was one of the many big deals that happened at the time, in a way that it's neither recorded in the structural fashion that we usually employ to describe the Black Death. Naturally, on Schwerpunkt, we will delve into that far and wide, meaning that we still have to talk about, the impact of the plague, even properly in the forma mentis, in art. There are all kinds of really of avenues you can take to analyze this phenomenon. And those surely hint at a severe impact. At the same time, this is also a general premise to try to explain the difference here between rural areas and cities. So you think that the city was just a place where most people died in terms of incidence of the spread, right, of the contagion, and so the likelihood of getting sick and die, basically, in the community. Still, it's worth noting that the population losses in cities were frequently offset by an influx of migrants from the countryside, right? This is typical of the era. The great medieval urban expansion had not really been the product of an actually equal growth in, say, natality. It's mostly people moving from the countryside to the major centers. We have described this very often. Mostly the suburbs outside of the city walls host the workers that are paid by the great guilds in the city to work in the cities with all the specialized crafts are under the supervision of the actual citizens that these people at large aren't, right? A bit like the poor. This is the fourth estate of the situation. We talked about them in many videos. These people are indeed the most vulnerable to the greater events, right? Cities had expanded historically, incorporating these various rings of not just inner walls, but as we just said, the suburbs that emerged just outside of them. So to enclose the latter and preserving their labor force. These people were, however, living in pretty bad conditions in general, as compared to the actual citizenry. There were times also more, because if you count all the people that literally came into the city just from the outer side, because it wasn't like the suburbs were entirely protected, even outside it, even the third or fourth wall ring, right? They were very poor, the most exposed, people that, again, could gain something, of course, from coming to live and work mostly in the city, because they were dispossessed, did not have, for example, land on their own, or the conditions that, again, they would have had in the countryside were considered too heavy. This varies. Naturally, we're talking Europe in general, so the shades can be many, but if we're talking about the great medieval metropolises that were really many and a lot, and they will be affected by the plague, we understand that these workers made a very poor living. They didn't have much fats, proteins to eat to stiffen their immunity resistance. They lived in conditions of bare sustenance to some extent. And so they weren't just biologically exposed to pathogen agents, they were at large incredibly susceptible to any kind of political turmoil. They would at some point be the protagonist of this as well. We know it from the Jacquerie, from the revolts of the textile workers, again in Italy, in Flanders. This happens far and wide. It takes on, again, many different faces depending on who we are discussing, which century, etc. The demic mobility, spatially speaking, is obviously impacted by these people that were hanging on like a very thin thread in order to keep them in a certain place, loyal to a certain institution, or just in a particular neighborhood, right? So as such, when we consider the massive drops in urban population at the outbreak of the Black Death, we don't have to think that literally all the missing residents had died of the plague. On the contrary, the city is, as we've seen many times, just basically the surplus. It embodies the hierarchically successful center of power that floats and rules over this multitude of countryside population. In the most extreme cases of very intense urbanism, the largest centers, etc., you have literally one inhabitant in the city for one in the countryside. This is typical, for example, of central northern Italy. So it's actually a lot. It's beyond. This tells you how impacting the Black Death at the end of the day was, because it wasn't just saying, look, there were fewer people in the city, so after all, you count the countryside, it doesn't look like a massive drop. We also know, of course, that many rural areas were hit, and this is what we're going to eventually end up demonstrating today, or at least showing, because there are several studies on the topic. Of course, it's nothing new, right? But as I was already pointing out before, it's not much about the answer that we're going to find here, but what this answer gives us in turn about our, say, about the heuristics of the same, meaning what can we derive from the level of historical awareness and accuracy in any kind of reconstruction of this broader people's movements and just phenomena in front of the plague. The rural regions themselves suffered considerable declines at the arrival of the Black Death. 2, right? Sticking to city examples, take Florence, that is by far the most and best documented city in the world. For instance, you have 1338, 1351 as timeline extremes. As far as we understand, and we can't be fully sure about this either, but these are exactly the years of not just the plague, but of a broader set of declining economic conditions, that there are major bankruptcies. All Europe is, again, involving towards what the Black Death appears just the explosion, something that had gone wrong before. All right, already from the mid-20s, but already from before, there had been major blows to Eurasian demographics and economy that are usually sort of the perspectively, like what historiography has studied the Black Death mostly from, because it's a topic that highly affects, of course, like social history. And so most of the scholars that studied this phenomenon mostly are connected with the idea that it's this big laboratory experiment, playing with numbers and figures and sorting out more or less what appears just on the basis of this general outlook, like a bigger macroscopical picture. The mistake this is not to say that, by the way, the calculations are that bad. In fact, they get, as we will learn now, pretty much in depth to several directions, and they can be quite locally in depth as well, which doesn't mean necessarily the person who carries out that research in loco, so to say, figuratively, will actually understand too much about the broader picture just from that information, if he had, by the way, the time to study the bigger picture adequately as well. Rather, the main issue is coming from a perspective of, this is just socioeconomical history, so everything evenemential, political, military, ideological is sort of looked upon with suspicion, and or as, we never use this methodologically speaking, at least in a fully integrated way, just like a structuralistic, when not Marxistic kind of trend is taken into question by Defoe, like eliminating, in fact, any other kind of consideration. So, as always, we have to be extremely cautious, right? I come from a research, for example, that shows things that you would think, but more or less we know what was happening at the time. Yes, we do. It's not like we lacked information. In general, we know what happened. But the actual quantities across Europe, like what was happening distinctly from a political, military, social, first of all, it's not really woven in together, right? These different fields do not really talk more than much to one another. Secondly, they literally are investigated for different reasons, for different purposes, for some sort of, in fact, mostly self-referential reason. And so it's very complicated to just have, one chronicler that tells us about, that there's a drop in these figures, and finding it, regardless of the much more in-depth research, still because it's the only authoritatively famous source that gives us the possibility that that was the scale in the drop, right? In fact, for Florence here, this is what we're talking about. Her population would plummet by half, from 100,000 to 50,000 residents. Now think about Boccaccio's novelle, for example, all the story of the Allegra Brigata that leave Florence, that go live in this rural residence. And this, of course, that's just what rich people could do to an extent. We know much less about those fourth estaters, right? And it's not like there is the plague and you just leave the city, by the way, because everything, especially in these regions, is tied to the city, right? There's not really a village. There are other worlds, for example, in France or in Germany, you have certain population that truly lives out there in the forest, and they're not really cut out from the rest of the world, but they do not fundamentally pivot around a city, right? Even though most people actually, especially in France, tend to do. It depends also on what degree of that dependency you understand. So people are irrational, and or they tend to make certain calculations that may not align entirely with the notion of let's just leave and let's just simply move. Where? Right? What does it mean to live in a city, for example? We're talking the countryside, we're talking the suburbs, because again, the distances here are not even that big, right? If you think about the same Italian communes here, their countryside, their district is something like a few hundred square kilometers. So it's not that huge of an area to begin with, and beyond that there is yet another city in the same ways. They're highly trafficked areas, by the way. They're not isolated. On the contrary, during these issues, for example, Florence had suffered some, actually Europe at this point had suffered, as we'll see later, better even important famines, right? And paradoxically, it was the bigger centers that could avoid the effects on their populace because they were bigger centers in Europe in virtue of their own wealth at large. And so they could simply buy wheat from abroad, right? The smaller centers couldn't quite do that. So that's yet another factor that complicates it. So even if, there is this major crack, everything jumps, logistical lines, etc., first of all, the system finds a way to go on. And secondly, still at that point, the city is the city. That's the center of the world, basically. And there is no way to go away from it, right? Food is going to be abundant in there compared to probably most other places. You can parasitically live to some extent also out of it in certain situations, especially if you work exploitedly by the same guilds that own those textile industries and tools and warehouses and so on. And they're literally the people that can pay for cheap grain so that you can eat some bread and drink some wine at the end of the day, and you're going to survive. It may suck as a diet, but we're talking the Middle Ages, and these are actually the most advanced places even. So it's not like in the outer world was a happy peasant that said, haha, look at those people living in the cities dying in droves because of the plague. And now I can't cultivate everything. I have my courtyard animals. It's like the peasantry is during these very generations collapsing. All right, totally. Like what you understand as the Ancien regime is founded basically on the subjugation of the final subjugation of the fourth estate that up to that point could even earn some place in parliaments, for example. Across Europe, there was nothing deterministic about their defeat, right? Instead, until the contemporary era, the mass state, the third estate revolutions, the peasantry is done for. Common people do not get anything. The later Middle Ages, very far from being anything that puts back again the individual at the center other than in an elitistic courtly sense, is the total collapse of any force, of any popular community whatsoever, right? And this must be clearly understood because it's not just how brutally they repressed the Jacquerie or the aforementioned city revolts. It's literally like the entire system collapsing also because of these idiots at the end of the day that thought that it could make or stage a revolution in a situation like that instead of helping the system being sustaining itself, reinforcing itself, and causing an enormous damage primarily to themselves and secondly to the entire system. Of course, this is not to say that they weren't actually oppressed and brutalized, but who wasn't at that time, including the nobility, that not just risked to be taken down at this point, but regularly risked their lives. But they risked investments to go for the third estate, for merchants, for anybody, right? So here, that on Schwerpunkt, we were always extremely vocal about these topics. There is a medieval society playlist that deals mostly with that. But again, bear in mind that when we read Florence passing from 100,000 to 50,000 residents from 1338, 1351, it was not even to say from, 1348 to 1360. There are other cities that have similar figures, but here from a date where we don't even know technically what happened. For example, from a demographic point of view in between, right? For example, Florence at this point is, again, the richest city in the world, literally, but she suffers important defeats at the hands of Pisa. There is a sort of internal revolt, right? There is a regime change, plus the plague. So there are lots of things going on around that you should try to take into account, but that factorializing is practically impossible from a quantitative point of view. And again, the delusion of socioeconomical history is giving you a deterministically materialistic pattern of interpretation, mostly based on figures that rest on mostly the calculation of moral forces that cannot be mathematically quantified, or could even be, roughly speaking, so to say, but on the basis of a heavy expertise in chiefly political and military history, which the people who study these things do not have by the slightest. Hell, not even who studies politics or war actually knows much about moral quantities or the art of war. You can imagine who has a socio-economical, historical background, so to say. However, and just to drive the point home here, when we speak of this 100,000 to 50,000 residents in Florence, respectively, between 1338 and 1351, we realize that the Florentine population rebounded over the following 3 decades, reaching about 75,000 by around 1380. Now, it's true that, as we'll learn later, in between this stuff, there is just a lot of damage caused by, the free companies, the general contraction of international economy, the same effect of the disease. But the question is, these people evidently were moving, right? They weren't simply springing out of the grass, like just being connected to a greater fertility, like these people were copulating like rabbits all of the sudden. That's not what happened. The system, it's a pre-industrial one. It's ridiculous compared to our rates of growth. So we understand that, again, the center is the center. The Florence is Florence, even more in this example. And that, thanks primarily to significant migration from nearby rural zones, it was possible to replenish the center. One could open a big parenthesis, by the way, where did these people come from exactly? Because as we explained before, yes, Florence had a pretty neatly organized countryside, etc. But, couldn't these people come from, across the Apennines? Couldn't come from the populace of cities that eventually declined, including the enemies of Florence? Pisa, again, kicks Florence's ass in 1340, but say at the end of this period, 1380, basically it's losing her autonomy because it was heavily structured in a political and social sense for reasons that we described in in the videos about medieval Pisa, and just we'll talk more specifically about these instances. And so it's incredibly difficult to trace this, if any, also because there is no modern cadastre. You do not know what these people were. There is no evidence, basically, of who they could be at large, or at least in detail. So it's just our wild guess. And how do you even try to quantify where did they come from? So what kind of impact they had, say, on the broader political and social system? It's that vague, right? You can also put together a theory. I'm sure that if you are a very good historian, you can find, by studying these things for years in this provincial context, say, some answer to. And there are studies on this. But at large, even some of the most advanced studies that I've seen tend just to picture things at the very, not just local level, but in a minimal sense, meaning that if something is not certain, like big theories trying to create something overly complicated, something that drives, not overly complicated, but something particularly complex that drives away from that hyper-specialization, does not figure. Basically, people do not study this stuff anymore. They don't even try to answer it. And my guess is that if you actually expand a bit your horizons, you don't even necessarily have to be a hyper expert on it. But say if you're an expert in other part of the Middle Ages and you are reasonably informed about what's happening all around, you can make this kind of criticism in a positive sense, trying to sort out what more or less in the bigger picture was going on. By the way, here we talk about Florence because, again, Florence is even the top example of documentability. Florence is the city in many ways. It's not the biggest city, but, for example, Milan is not as well documented, nor Paris, for example. So, and again, these are different, importantly different cities for the time being, and different dynamics could have played out there. We said it before. Milan, for example, seemingly escaped the plague. How? Nobody knows. How do we know it? Because essentially, the local chroniclers or others do not specifically talk about the Milanese suffering incredibly from the plague. And so the impression is that this didn't happen, which is, again, even plausibly possible, of course. The sense is that you should always listen to the sources, especially the narrative ones, because they are, especially before the crisis, some of the best concerning the expectational accuracy of themselves, meaning that who read them was doing so still in a relatively public communitary sense, and so you couldn't really write something that was not true, or that people would basically saying this is not, what's this? I didn't live in this city, whatever. So we know this pretty well, actually, and that's the least of field where you should be paranoid. What you should be paranoid about, well, you shouldn't be paranoid in general, but we should be extremely aware of is scholarship, because scholarship does its job in certain aspects of this, but in order to speak the bigger about the bigger stuff, like it's probably the worst thing, especially contemporary scholarship. It's absolutely atrocious from essentially the 1970s, especially the different degrees in the war. Now, even so, the overarching trend points to a sharp decrease in population. By the mid-15th century, so we're one century later, towns and cities had far fewer inhabitants than they did before the so-called Black Death. And the same was true for villages, many of which were entirely deserted and ceased to exist as rural settlement hubs. Evidently, something had seriously changed in the countryside, possibly far worse than in the city. by proportion. And we're not talking just about absolute terms, because at large in Europe, as we said before, it was normal. In pre-industrial world, most people lived outside the city, in the countryside proper, but in literal relative terms compared to the city. Actually, and I don't remember how many videos I made about this, but we talked about it profusely. It's just very well known if you're versed in late medieval, especially government history. It's a thing about the Bonne Ville de France, that kind of sort of institutional build-up that starts, or at least starts pivoting ever more around the city, right? The idea that cities really suck into like the whole countryside, politically, socially, into them, right? Meaning that, again, the peasants do not count practically anything in this system, if not as subject labor force, and the city instead is elevated to a role of institutional representative of especially monarchic authority in the various provinces, right? This happens everywhere. We know that, for example, immediately after the plague, long-range trade did not diminish in reach at all, right? It diminished in, I don't think it even actually diminished, in the sense that the system notoriously ended up favoring the elites, as we said before, that began to trade at ever greater distance, especially luxury stuff, to an unprecedented level, right? Before the Black Death, you would imagine, for example, lots of grain traveling, mostly from region to region, like not overwhelming tours, even though certain specific goods were, of course, like coming from very far away, also transcontinentally, as a matter of fact. But after the Black Death, the elite actually continues to intensifies properly long-range trade, and even strengthens further, because the actual hubs of this were the cities that had reinforced, had subjected the countryside, where peasants had been even fairly autonomous up to that point. In terms of political autonomy, political liberty, a peasant in the 12th and 13th century was much better off than one in later Middle Ages or the early modern era. Then, of course, at some point, the system grows so that you can start arguing that, yes, of course, like in the 17th, the 18th century, as a peasant, you could be heavily exploited, whatever, but at large, you had it better to an important degree. Like if you had asked a peasant in the 12th century, he would have gladly switched place. After all, this subjection, paradoxically, had been largely consensual. Like the notion, it's not like this where the poor that were exploited and oppressed. These were people who accepted the fact that without protection, they were done for. Literally so, as we'll see now, because that's the factor that you must absolutely take into account in this dynamic. War. A lot of war, right? A lot of political instability. And so that's what actually matters here. Also in terms of dynamic movements across the map, so to say, right? So we picture here this massive drop in agricultural population after the Black Death. It is surely due to, just like in the city, by the way, conversely, due to the plague, to actual people dying of sickness in the aftermath of this. But that, when you look at this at a century distance, leaving aside, of course, that the plague had never gone away, again it routinely came back, but you also realize that the system had begun recovering, by the way, as gradually. So it did not have the same levels as before. Again, the Europe of the full Middle Ages is overwhelmingly more populated than the late medieval one, and you have to wait basically the 17th century to have even cities, right, the 18th even, or the 19th in some cases, to re-expand just in terms of communities to that medieval circles. But we understand here that it's not just about people being wiped out by the plague, but that the entire rural settlement system, in many ways, had brutally declined. Brutally. And again, it still has its backbone, it's still there. It hasn't disappeared, But as we will learn now in the figures, it was a pretty heavy blow. One that the cities, in a sense, probably also contributed to form, meaning that if people died, for example, like others could have taken their place, and so coming from the countryside, taking place of that. But as we understand, also in a broader political sense, if there is a shrinking in the rural areas at large, it's because, and we know the system at large has shrunk as well, the rural areas, as we observed before, have also lost leverage compared to the city itself, right? That could, however, sustain itself through the same rural production, showing that the connections, let's say, between the city and the countryside had brutally shifted in favor of the city anyway. Now, the reasons or contributing factors behind these rural abandonments were varied, of course. Some stemmed from the loss of residents to plague or migration to urban centers, as we just pointed out, while others arose from rural inhabitants fleeing villages due to factors that at least directly had nothing to do with the plague. That is mostly war-related devastation or shifts in agricultural and political institutional structures in the countryside. Right? This is actually the most interesting part of the war, because if you just consider like demic shift as it's something you can't even track, meaning there are less people here, where did they go? You don't know, right? We're guessing here how many people died during the plague or with the plague in the following cycle. This is unanswerable, right? We have some guesses, but we can't be precise about. So the abandonment of rural communities was of course a widespread phenomenon across Europe. Also in other times, though its severity differed by region. At least in this case, we talk about it because in the relative period you have the biggest abandonment, right, of villages, etc. So that it's obviously connected with what surely, again, the Black Death had triggered, but not necessarily created just per se as a premise, right? Now, the sheer quantity of forsaken villages is really staggering, right? First of all, from a historiographical point of view, English scholarship uses the term lost villages. In Germany, there is the term Wüstungen, that means literally like some deserted areas, right? In France, the term is village déserté. So you have all different national variations, let's say, in terms of how many people actually died. There are, by the way, catastrophistic estimates that tell you, I don't know, from 30 to 50% of Europeans died with plague. This is not true, of course. You have to understand these changes progressively. And again, when you especially stretch out the timeline of trying to understand what happened beyond 1347, 48, you realize that there must have been other factors, at least mathematically, that were increasingly preponderant besides the plague, right? We just talked about the German Wüstungen, and here we have an example for the country where 170,000 rural sites were documented at the start of the 14th century. That, let's stress it, is at least the end of a great period of expansion. Germany had reached the same population of Italy, more or less, so it's huge, right? For the first time in history, by the way. And of these, again, 170,000 rural sites in Germany documented at the start of the 14th century, roughly 40,000 had vanished in the 16th century, the beginning of the Renaissance. By the time of, you would add here also the German peasants' revolt that we documented. So this is also a bit tricky, because telling the truth, when you study countries like Germany or England, you realize that they had come later to for example, countries like France and Italy in terms of demographic expansion historically during the Middle Ages had risen faster in relative terms, but in part also for this, given that they were potentially less developed countries, they had less systems to absorb this, so that when the crisis hits, it hits harder, by the way, but it also hits later at large because they had more breathing, let's say, in terms of expansion. But when they arrive at the last moment, pick again, the English peasant revolt happens at the beginning of the 15th century, right? Central Europe has Bohemia with the German peasants' revolt. We're talking 15th, 16th century. It's as if what France had with the Jacquerie in the mid 14th century, or Italy had with the Florence with the Ciompi revolt in the same period. These countries had delayed 1-2 centuries later, right? And this is actually a real deal thing, also because those countries sort of had more difficulties to recover from that later on, demographically and socially, and so it's they had sort of less spark compared to what they had during the Middle Ages, right? So you see, however, this phenomenon a bit generalized. For example, in England, we just mentioned, you have similar abandonment of rural villages in staggering quantity. In the southern and island regions of Italy, interestingly enough, these were the feudal parts of Italy. And once we know Sicily, Sardinia, the Kingdom of Naples, they all went through pretty severe crises. Actually, there were even more resources in some of the richer parts to mess things up. But the fact that these were feudal areas, and so that they were, in a way or another, politically, institutionally more, not necessarily more vulnerable per se, but they didn't have really, for example, the same amount of qualitative wealth in wealth collection of other institutions, like makes you really think. Like there were bigger systems, were very powerful, but that extracted their wealth in sort of clumsier way, and so burned lots of that as well. So this already tells you that the depopulation there wasn't even practically a matter of absolute wealth, because some of these areas were fairly rich, like for the European average, and yet they behaved like some other poorer ones. This happened, by the way, in parts of France, the Iberian Peninsula. We will see now that there are reasons, like I made an entire video about the free companies in France that shows you how capillary in certain areas, especially the Loire Valley and pretty much everything south of it, the devastations really were. So those were caused by the Anglo-Gascon chevauchée. And so they have a few to do with the Black Death just per se. We know this also from videos about medieval trade routes that radically shifted, mostly because of war. Right? Had it been because of the plague, you could have had certain specific phenomena triggered by the imbalance, let's say, but things would have been gentler. Instead, you understand here that there is a heavy steering of many trade routes due, surprise, to places where there was a lot of war. In areas, by the way, that had not witnessed much of that in the previous century, like France was really that kind, meaning that, yes, wars had more or less always been around, but after the Battle of Poitiers, we really have like half of the country without protection. And so it's an unprecedented situation. There are other areas that have lots of war at this point, but where you do not see displacement. So here you see yet another feudal vulnerability that, however, in the case of France, will still bring some results back later. I mean, England wasn't, aside from the victories on the battlefield. It wasn't faring excessively better in a general sense. In part, that's also why they went out there, right, acting like that. The Iberian Peninsula was also very composite, and historically there had been lots of struggles, not just during the Reconquista, but even later. There were wars, further invasions from Africa, telling the truth at this point. We also saw this in different videos about 14th century warfare. There was a lot of warfare also between the same Christians. So, especially in areas that were a bit more habituated to pastoralism and or to some kind of frontier warfare, it was possible for people to be relocated, maybe even just in there, because it's not necessarily like the crisis. Like, again, people must have moved from somewhere to somewhere else. And so it's not even about just, again, dead people. It's where would they actually go? There are areas that are not so capillarly urbanized, so this sounds like more like peasants that move in some important fashion from region to region, right? This is also the era, for example, of further Vlachization of certain areas of Central Europe. The Vlachs suddenly appear almost out of nowhere because they descend from the mountains and they go settle in areas where some sanitary settlements had been abandoned, and they repopulate them, even though the general picture has brought to an absolute shrink in population. In fact, you see the same dynamic in Northern and Eastern Europe as well. It's so transversal that it definitely looks like the plague triggered that, if we didn't know that the era before the plague was a pretty big mess due to mostly the stagnation of the system, mostly connected with the same wars that were ravaging the continent, right? And I am a strong proponent, differently from, again, those structuralist scholars that want to sort of deviate mostly towards the systemic, the socialistic and agriculturalistic explanation of wartime causing this rural depopulation, right? It's not just a factor you can juggle with pretending it's not there or combine. Of course, it's combined with socio-economical causes, it's combined with a plague, it's combined with lots of other issues, but it surely had nothing to do just as individual causes with war per se. But it's all compounded. There is a lot of war. You cannot look at this period and not to see in this free companies at the moment of a broader civilizational scale, something that had happened during the migration era, during the second invasions. Right? We can't treat 14th century Europe like it's just it's a block pattern of socio-economical indicators, not seeing what was happening as a major moment of major crisis, from which, by the way, the system recovers pretty well. This is not the end of medieval civilization. It's the one of its further, compaction towards directions that would effectively be, in fact, the Renaissance ones. Here you count a myriad of wars, by the way, that we can't fully picture even just in the moral essential, when we don't have, in fact, the voices of those who suffered of them, where we know of major devastations. But when you look at both large wars and smaller clashes, you hardly even ever have the voice of the soldiers that participated into them, the ones of the local populace. So we have terrible pages. Again, some people describe this pretty thoroughly, etc. But at large, we miss the thing. And so we often just study, even as military historians, like the sheer military essence of the thing, but we don't stop by and say, well, what would people behave like encountering these martyrs or whatever? At least that's where, in fact, even a social background would be useful, but only when it's compenetrated with a world picture, right? And I would say the more you study military history, the more you understand that dimension, though. I don't know how it is from the social side of the story. It seems to me that things are a bit less open in that environment. In any case, we think about this: local skirmishers, feuds among noble factions. This, by the way, had always existed to a degree, including the burning of villages, the dispersion of livestock. Made a video about late medieval livestock, by the way, if you're interested in some specific areas across, I think it was Spain, Switzerland, and East Germany. So ruining crops were, etc., were tactics used to undermine the foundations of adversaries. And this, of course, struck from a socioeconomical point of view, but it's part of the war. This was a standard military strategy that had historically prompted either temporary or permanent desertion of settlements. So some scholars say during the 14th and 15th centuries, when combined with the demographic crisis, this practice intensified its destabilizing impact on settlement patterns. War often forced the residents of one or several villages to consolidate into pre-existing or newly formed centers that offered greater safety and protection. This consolidation might happen organically, as rural people sought refuge by decree of local authorities or through mutual arrangements between communities and their lords. We observed in the affirmation of an ever more permanent and professional corps of French royal forces how essentially this proceeded from the billeting of some, at that point, partly salaried companies into specific towns that were, in that sense, to be garrisoned by these troops against the enemy chevauchée raids. So, regardless of the fact that those raids would have partly continued, etc., but of course, if, for example, like you inhabited the neighboring countryside that was being laid waste by the enemy, and you knew that in that other town, say 30 kilometers away, there were royal forces, and you would have been protected. You would have, say, migrated there and decided to remain. And or just, you understand how immediately that military presence, for example, would have stabilized the situation defensively. And so, even after the threats subsided, many vulnerable settlements that had been left behind never saw a revival, because at the end of the day, the communities as well consider themselves ever more compactly as the metus hostilis increases. We know that in the history of civilization at large, some of the most importantly civic, political, and also military accomplishments are achieved after a main threat strikes. Right, this is true. I don't know, think about the sack of Rome by Brennus and how this triggered the Camillian reforms that are basically the embryo of the manipular ones. There is, these are just, again, the Romans called it metus hostilis because it's literally like the fear of the enemy, but intended as, a sort of awareness that prompts response. This is true for other, I don't know, think at this point, the Swiss Confederacy. It's another story, telling the truth. But it's still something that points towards that direction. There are leagues of cities. We've seen them in Germany, in Swabia, in the Rhineland. Technically, I mean, the Swiss Confederacy was the same thing. In fact, some of these communities weaponize, like they collect the Landfried practice, like that was once, it was a public one. So it technically belonged to freemen as well to enact, but it had historically been an imperial, royal, at least prerogative. And this is brought, this brings to pacification, which means, by the way, further war to an extent, but policing and maintaining the countryside tidy in that sense. So you have a lot of strengthening around more corporative forms in the later Middle Ages, which is the entire point that brings the city to actually suffer less as the main center that will fundamentally remain at this point, right? Regardless of still the lack of fixity in, for example, the existence of a proper capital, because courts were itinerant, but they itinerated cities at that point, and were also maintained by those. They competed among them. They were ever welter. So if you look at, I don't know, after especially the end of the 100 Years' War of Lyon, so like you have an increasingly large affirmation of the city as the cornerstone of the local dominations. And this seems to be brutally accelerated by the Black Death, so that at the end of the day, cities recover, the countryside, in a broader political and social sense, actually does not. Right, and in part this also has a psychological and moral explanation, which is also the most difficult to picture, at least the most difficult to reconstruct, but that at the end of the day explains a lot of it, because these people had really lost a center. Right, the Black Death in itself was a traumatic event. People, of course, had many traumatic events in this period. I don't think that, seeing a free company raiding your house would have been this more pleasant experience, unless, depending on how you would come out of it. But the sense being at large that the world is not like before. All right, there is a great destabilization that seemingly threatens constituted order, civilization, to an unprecedented level, one that had really never been memorized by this populace, and that was especially not something that people simply suffered, but it's something that they enacted themselves. Right, it's a major crisis stemming not again from the plague that simply comes externally, because remember, this is very important also ideologically, because if you're a structuralist and you document the say socioeconomical phenomena, the entire point is that the people were oppressed, right? And you see their revolt as just the system failed short and failed them in a way, so they revolted. And it was not revolt. What about they actually triggered that? What about the actual fault of the system collapsing was this constant erosion of authority, of especially public authority, of institutions, of constituted order, that, by the way, ended up reinforcing as a consequence of the collapse of the peasantry, as we've seen. So those who had tried to rebel, obviously those people are always the most pernicious. They are always the ones that actually are going to damage civilization, that do not know how to handle it, do not have the means to improve their own condition, by the way, and in fact end up like it's the unequivocally macroscopical and traumatic sense the late medieval peasant history, the one of complete subjection, of failure of every single revolution attempted that was caused by the destruction of the entire system at the worst as a consequence. This is actually the answer that I think we should tend to give here, that civilization actually won at a great cost, though. Also, in fact, in the seeds of its moral development, because at the end of the day, the Renaissance was not as a traditional moment as it had, as the past centuries had been. In the 13th century, a few generations before this, even beginning in the 14th, there was a strong idea of papacy and empire, of wealth and Ghibellines, of like the power, the might, the universal and imperial reach, even of single feudal monarchies, right? After this, there is a sabotage of the entire idea of a universal order. There is a further fragmentation into national states that actually take forever before they can get more powerful than they had been before. Some collapsing completely, like, I don't know, Bohemia during the Hussite Revolution, and ending up under somebody else's government, etc. So it's from whichever angle you look at this, you realize that at large, this is not, again, the laboratory experiment where you see what happens to people when an external random factor like a pandemic hits. That is very important, surely affects you, but we have also in contemporary times, in the past years, the most obvious observation. Lesser people are not capable of handling themselves, right? These events trigger just a further degeneration of people's individual worth and value. They sink, right? This entire notion that, again, if you bring the populace in charge, it's going to be better for you. No, actually, the average person is going to have a worse life. And it may not even be totally a negative thing, meaning that whoever rises to power has a reason for some reason. But it's literally the outcome also that is fascinating here. That is, everybody gets what they deserve, so that individual people always get worse in these times. And in fact, they never really achieve more from stagnating situations, crisis, shrinking, etc. And then we're in the eye of that storm, right? So this is largely, again, I said it many times because I also specialize roughly in this period. The level of collapse is staggering, mostly from a moral dimension. That the material one is always a reflection of, because it's moral that change things, not matter. And people essentially decided to bail out of the system, to destroy, to exploit every situation for personal gain, in damaging the entire system and making the average person living ever worse. And obviously that came from largely the average person, because the average person first had power, more power at least, and now it didn't. Right? So it's a very instructive event, and when you see Wu won and Wu lost, you have the verdict whether it was worth it or not. So this is also looking at these beautiful maps of Europe here, the various cities, and consider how worthy civilization is. Consider what happens when it collapses. Consider what happens to people when this collapses, right? And be more grateful for what you have and strive for making it work better, not for sabotaging, for destroying, because everybody can see that if you're a lesser person, you are a lesser person. And actually, like, making more people lesser people will not make you living better, because you will at that point be more straightly treated as a lesser human being, where here we were at least given the benefit of the doubt, which is also most of the times a very silly thing to do. So again, we're happy also. We're unhappy for civilization to take those turns, but at least we are at least satisfied by the fact that the less deserves all that they get, and so that they don't get for that matter, and so we're actually fine with that. Looking at the channels stuff we made on these topics, there is properly a playlist about the late medieval crisis. That here I'm not making too long videos. This is the 21st video we make about that topic, which is not even strictly, like, if you look at all the videos I uploaded, actually too much about the crisis per se. I made lots of videos about the crisis. The one about the free companies was actually pretty fitting, but there is here the ideological implications of the peasant struggle, Jacquerie English revolt in Hussites, post-crisis Italian banking giants, that also is actually quite telling about properly that civilizational core that remains. Medieval European countryside and transformation in 14th century, the Black Death and its consequences, thinking late medieval peasant revolts, the 14th century crisis and its consequences, a historiographical perspective, the collapse of peasant income after the mid-14th century crisis. This is actually very fitting. Black Death, a short history. Late medieval European demographic fall, medieval peasant revolts, 14th century Europe, a system in crisis. We actually made a lot. Fragmentary crisis, epidemics and reversal of demographic trend, late 13th, mid 14th century. Mindset in the face of the pandemic, Europe 1348. So yeah, some of these I should in theory even re-upload, but there is just so much we can do sometime. But I think that, again, those mental, that mindset, those mental frames that we were talking about before are all very crucial in here, because they, in a sense, reflect the sense of withdrawal. I would say in times of crisis, the sense of withdrawal seems an easy escape, an easy way out, And instead it does nothing but damaging the system further in ways that you didn't have to. Like, it's mostly a mental issue. It's not really even like things are going that badly in the meanwhile. Or of course, we're talking in 14th century, so it's not to say that life was easy. So today we are even less motivated to do this. And in fact, this is the reason why we're way more feeble. And this doesn't make sense at large. Made lots of views, particular videos. These ones are practically not. Well, many are re-uploads because these were easy re-uploads. But we have to be a bit more productive regarding to this, because sometimes you look at it and you say, "Oh my God, you made so many videos." Yeah, okay, but it's not really everything. Of course, and it's even for certain topics, really, we didn't make too much. We should be extremely more. People watch the stuff more in the past. I don't exactly know why. It's as if, perhaps that interest in structuralism faded a little bit, but I don't think it's simply that. I think there is some sort of denial, bit of some hardcore causes of the war and how to interpret them and make history. History, tended to rightly evolve towards some political attention at the end of the day. But again, we will see probably all this stuff in some more dedicated video. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.